We're going to focus on this session called Going Vocal, How to Advocate in Today's Volatile Political Climate. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Rich Meade, who's Managing Director and Chair of the Health Practice at Prime Policy Group. He has over 20 years of legislative and political experience, and I had to write this down because it's so impressive. Previous to Prime Policy Group, Rich served with the House Budget Committee Chairman Jim Nussle. Serving most recently as Chief of Staff to the House Budget Committee, Rich was the committee's principal liaison to the House leadership, the administration, and all committees of the House of Representatives. He was also the budget staff's leading policy director. He also served as Congressman Nussle's personal office as legislative assistant, legislative director, chief of staff, and lead policy advisor for the committees on which he served, including Ways and Means, Banking and Financial Services, and the Agriculture Committee. Prior to that, Rich worked for former Congressman Tom Tauck and served on Congressman Tauck's U.S. Senate campaign. He's been a guest on C-SPAN public affairs programs and a featured speaker at numerous industry conferences and events, including addresses at the National Press Club. He also served as an advisor on economic matters to the re-election campaign of President George W. Bush in 2004. Rich graduated with distinction from the George Washington University with a bachelor's degree in economics. Please join me in welcoming Rich Meade.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the very generous introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. As Stephanie mentioned, I'm with Prime Policy Group, and we're a bipartisan government affairs firm in Washington, D.C. We've got about 20 senior lobbyists like myself who've worked in high levels in the government, both on Capitol Hill and in administrations. We're about evenly divided. We've got about 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans, and we tend to keep it that way so that as things change in Washington, we don't really have to change that much to adapt to whoever the new players are. What I thought I'd do today is some of you are very, like Debbie is now becoming an expert in advocating in Washington, her new capacity as the president-elect of her association. And some of you may be familiar with how Washington works, and some of you may not be as familiar. So I thought I'd start with sort of the basics of how our government's structured and how it works, and then talk about the tactics and strategies you can use to influence the government. I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the current health policy issues there before the Congress in Washington. And then finally turn to the 2014 elections. We are luckily within 50 days of the next elections, and all this advertising and drama and who wins and loses will be decided with, and we can move on and hopefully have a little bit of respite from politics before we turn to the next election cycle. The profession of lobbying is one of the oldest professions in our country, and in fact we are protected by the Constitution. The First Amendment to the Constitution says that citizens can petition the government for redress of grievances. That's lobbying. That's what we do. If you have a problem with the government, you can go and tell them what you think is wrong, and you can try and seek to change it. And so when you talk about advocacy and lobbying in Washington, sometimes there's sort of this negative connotation where they think, oh, well, big businesses or big associations are, trying to line their pockets or what have you. But the truth of the matter is there are a lot of very noble and admirable advocacy efforts that go underway every day in Washington, whether it's the Boys and Girls Clubs of America or the Red Cross or Cancer Society. There's lots of advocacy that goes on for very good reasons. It's not always, even though the First Amendment talks about redress of grievances, there's also opportunities to partner and cooperate with the federal government. We, in fact, we partnered with one of the agencies, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We partnered with them to create a health information exchange. So rather than having to manually enter health data, we set up a system. A long, arduous process, took years, both in advocacy and creation, but we have a process now where the members of the National Renal Administrators can electronically submit their data to CMS through this health information exchange, and that was something we partnered with them on quite effectively. So the founders of our country envisioned three co-equal branches of the government, the Congress, the legislative branch, the administration, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Most of what we do is with the legislative and executive branch. It's not to say the judicial branch can't impact policy it does, and there is a way to work with that. And occasionally we will integrate a legal team into what we do, but not terribly often. So I'm mostly going to focus on the legislative and executive branches today, and that those three branches have a historical and I think healthy tension between them. And it's not necessarily a partisan thing. I'll never forget, it was September either 12th or 13th of 2001, and I got called to the Speaker of the House's office in the Capitol, and we were there to receive a request from the Office of Management and Budget. Mitch Daniels, who's the director, came to the joint bicameral bipartisan leadership and said, I need $10 billion to respond to this, to clean up the mess and to beef up security and all this. And in a bicameral bipartisan way, we basically said no. in that they wanted $10 billion and we'll figure out how to spend it. And Congress said no. We've got the power of the purse, and we'll work with you. And we spent from about 2 in the afternoon past midnight negotiating out how much money, and that $10 billion grew to 20 over the course of that afternoon. And of course, more details, and flushed it out. And then the next morning, without any opposition, the bill sailed through the Congress. So anyway, that historical and natural tension is, I think, probably a good thing and does exist. Not to say there's not partisan tension as well, but the entities do have a little bit of tension. I'm going to walk you through the legislative process in Congress, and this is sort of the textbook way of how it should work. I wouldn't necessarily say that it is currently operating like it was envisioned in the Schoolhouse Rock video or in the the textbook for how it works, but this is how it's supposed to work. And I could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about how it isn't working and how to try and fix it, but just let me walk you through kind of some of the basics. And the way a bill becomes a law is a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate has to introduce a bill, and they literally take the draft legislation and they sign it, and they send it down to the House or Senate floor, and it's enrolled, meaning they assign a number to it that night, and they refer it to committee. The committees will hold hearings and hold what they call a markup session, where they literally mark up and change the bill, send it to the House or Senate floor for vote, and then the other body will start their process all over again. And in order for a bill to become a law, it has to be passed both bodies in the identical form. And so when you have the House and Senate who pass different versions of the bill, they can work it out a few different ways, one of which is to convene what we call a conference committee, where the leadership will appoint negotiators from the committees of jurisdiction from each body to negotiate out the differences, and they work it out, and then they'll send back to both bodies the same bill for an up or down vote. Or they do what they call the ping pong method, where the House will pass a bill and send it to the Senate will change it and send it back to the House, and the House will change it and send it back to the Senate, and kind of ping pong it back and forth until it's resolved. The Congress as a whole, comprised of the House and Senate, is really two separate and very unique institutions in terms of House of Representatives of the United States Senate. There's an old story about a freshman Democratic member of Congress who got elected and was lamenting to one of his senior colleagues about the Republicans in the House being the enemy. He said, no. The Republicans are our opposition. The Senate is the enemy. And so there's, again, some healthy and historic tension. But in the House, policy is much more driven by the committees. And so if you really want to impact or change a bill, generally done at the committee level in terms of amendments and changes. Because once the bill is reported from committee in the House, it goes to this entity called the Rules Committee. So every time the House of Representatives considers a piece of legislation, the Rules Committee, which is a leadership-driven committee, the ratio on the committee is 2 to 1 plus 1. So there's 9 members for the majority party and 4 for the minority. So they set the rules for every bill. So how long it's debated, what kinds of amendments are offered, what kind of protection against points of order, what's left vulnerable to a point of order. Every bill, they figure that out ahead of time. So when the leadership is determining the rules of the game, they usually win the game. So it's really hard, or harder, I should say, to change a bill on the House floor. In the Senate, it's a much more open and deliberative process where any one senator generally can offer any amendment to any bill at any time. And so with that dynamic, you can see more accommodation, more things worked out on the Senate floor. And the committee structure is a lot less important than it is in the House. Knowing how to navigate all these complexities it can be a challenge. It's not something that volunteer associations can't do. They do it on a regular basis. But you just have to have some base level understanding in terms of jurisdictions. Again, on the House side, which committee has jurisdiction is very important, because if you write a bill, depending on how you draft a bill, will determine which committee it goes through. Some committees are easier or harder to navigate than others, and there's times where you write a bill and it can get sent to 2 committees, and that can be a real problem because it's hard to get 2 committees to act simultaneously on the same piece of legislation. So oftentimes we'll advise clients to say, rather than include all those provisions in this bill, why don't you just maybe split them up and have 2 bills, or have 1 bill and leave that other policy to the side, so you only have to navigate through 1 committee to get it through. The leadership in the House and Senate do play a role in setting policy, but again, how you can use leadership in terms of using leadership to influence committees, or using committees to influence leadership or individual House and Senate members, it's more of an art than a science. And there are certain issues, quite honestly, that the leadership just will not engage on. The Speaker of the House is not going to worry about all the little details of all the bills. So knowing when you can use them or whether you can use them is important to know. As I mentioned about the House Rules Committee, which is a unique entity, the Senate has its unique, standing rules of the Senate, and both can present challenges in terms of getting bills passed. We had a client that came to me, and the Constitution says that all revenue measures must originate in the House. And so if the Senate passes a revenue measure, a tax bill, and sends it to the House can do what we call blue slip. And they literally take a blue piece of paper and basically write a note to the Senate saying, we're not buying it. No thank you. We're not going to take action on it. And so the client called and said, yeah, the bill we're working on got a blue slip. What in the world is a blue slip? I said, okay, I'll explain to you how it works, and let's figure out how to undo that problem. And let's figure out how to reboot this and restart that. So knowing those rules and how to navigate them is also very important. Same thing with the budgetary rules and restrictions there. In Congress, there's a nonpartisan agency called the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Budget Office prepares for every bill that the House and Senate considers an analysis of what the fiscal impact of that legislation is. So they score the bill relative to the current policies. And knowing how that process works, because if you get a big score, meaning it's going to cost a lot, it's harder to move those bills than bills that either save money or don't cost anything at all. So understanding that process, and again, you don't have to be a PhD economist to understand some of that things will either cost a lot of money, or you may have a decent idea of the range, or won't cost anything at all. So what are some of the tools that you would have in your toolbox to shape policy in Congress? I mean, the first and foremost is meeting with members of Congress and staff. There's an entity in Washington. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization called the Congressional Management Foundation. And they were designed to help members of Congress and their staffs operate better, more efficiently. They have, each member of Congress has an office budget. How do you most effectively, efficiently run your office and stay within your budget? And one of the things they do is they survey members and staff on various issues. And interestingly enough, they surveyed random blind survey of members of Congress. And almost every member of Congress believes that they are doing what their constituents want. And that seems like a disconnect because of how unpopular Congress is with the public. But if you talk to the individual representatives, senators, they say, I go home and I listen to my constituents and I read the mail and I'm doing what I'm being asked to do, I think. And so they do value the importance input of a constituent or constituent groups or representatives of constituent groups in meetings in their office. You can also conduct member and staff briefings, whether it's on an issue or a bill or both. There are different caucuses and organizations in the Congress, so whether you do it sort of broad and invite all comers to hear about an important issue to you and your organization, or you more narrowly, more targeted it, there's a conservative group of moderate Democrats in the House called the Blue Dogs, and we've organized for clients when they've had complex issues. We've organized briefings with all the Blue Dog staff just to talk about a complex issue and bring them along and get them up to speed. There's Congressional Kidney Caucus is one group of members who are interested in and care about kidney disease, so we'll often work with them to set up briefings on various issues. You can also use the congressional hearings to highlight, again, issues or bills, and whether something you care about is subject to the hearing, or you use that hearing as a platform to raise your issue, you can do it both ways. So oftentimes when committees hold hearings, they're very open and receptive to receiving written testimony to the hearing record. So you can use that form that if the Ways and Means Committee is going to have a hearing on the Part D program, the Medicare prescription drug program. If you've got an issue with the prescription drug, and again, whether it's exactly relevant to the committee hearing or not, you can submit written testimony on behalf of your organization to the committee, and then you can use that to send it on to your membership, to the media, or both, to show what you're doing to try and advocate for your issue using that forum as an opportunity to do so. Same thing with the committee reports. Every time a committee passes or reports a bill, they have to issue a written report, and the written report basically summarizes the bill, gives a history for why they are passing the bill, et cetera, et cetera. We had a client that had developed a blood safety device that was seeking approval from the Food and Drug Administration. Well, the Food and Drug Administration was kind of taking their sweet time approving this. So we simply went to the committee that funds the Food and Drug Administration and just put a provision in the committee report that says, hey, FDA, what are you doing about blood safety? Please report back to us within 90 days on what you're doing to improve blood safety. Well, that turned the light on. I mean, they started really racing and acting to approve it. In fact, we hope and think it will get approved this fall. So you can use the committee reports and committee actions to nudge the agencies in the right direction. And you can also draft legislation amendments. You can use the appropriations process. Each year, Congress passes, used to be 13, I think it's down to 12 now, but they pass individual appropriations bills to fund the federal government. And you can seek to increase funding for a function that you think your memberships might be able to benefit from. You can also use it as a little bit of a hammer to tell an agency, don't move forward on this. And you can write into these appropriations bills that a provision that basically says no money can be used to implement this rule or to act on this policy. And so you can use it as a little bit of a hammer too to try and get the agencies to pull back if you don't like the direction they're going. You can also use the administration to try and influence the Congress. There's on major pieces of legislation, the White House will put out what they call a SAP, a Statement of Administration Policy. And you can use that process to try and shape bills moving through Congress. You can also more informally work with the agencies to try and get them, get your views on pending legislation known. Because oftentimes the committees will reach out to the agencies and say, what do you guys think? We're thinking of doing this. What do you think? What's your reaction? And working behind the scenes to try and prep the agency to either be favorable or unfavorable towards it, depending on what you're trying to do, can be effective as well. As I mentioned, the members of Congress really truly believe that they're listening to their constituents. And again, the Congressional Management Foundation asks the staff, if your member has not made up their mind on an issue, what's the most effective way to influence their decision? 97% said, come in, have a meeting in our Washington office. 97% said that's the most effective way to move them some or a lot on an issue. 96% said having that meeting in this home state or district is the most important. or is the most effective way to do it. They also like hearing from leaders in the community, whether it's association leaders or other leaders in the community. Constituent letters, contacts, emails also are important. The only thing about the mail and written communication is that these offices are inundated. They get, on average, 6,000 pieces of mail, whether it's email or snail mail, each month. So it's important to do it, but developing that one-on-one relationship, whether it's with the member or staff, in addition to the mail, is really important. You really want to get to the point where the staff, you can pick up the phone and get directly with the office, or better yet, they're calling you to say, what do you think? And so it takes some time, and it does take some engagement and activity to develop that. Our last speaker talking about developing that trust, and it is hard and takes time, but over time you can do it and you can develop relationships. You can also, peer-to-peer lobbying is also very effective. If you can get one member of Congress to talk to another member of Congress about your issue or about what you're trying to accomplish, that can be very effective, whether they're talking to the chair of their committee or to leadership or just peer-to-peer to help try and build support for what you're doing. But that member engagement is really, really important. And interestingly enough, on the House floor, they have the live roll call votes where they ring the bells and the members have to come to the House floor and they take it looks like a credit card, but they put a card that identifies them and then they press the red or green button for yes or no on the bill. And that process is utter chaos. If you ever watch C-SPAN, you see all these people ambling around. Well, if you're actually on the floor when the vote's called, because they have, I think, music or something playing during the vote on C-SPAN, if you're on the floor, it is utter chaos. It's like being in a high school dance. It's like this constant noise, and that's because all the members during those votes are running around talking to their peers and colleagues, and hey, what do you think about this issue? Will you co-sponsor my bill? Will you sign this letter? There's all kinds of activity that goes on during those votes. So again, fostering those member-member contacts can be very, very effective.
Rich, just one thing. Does anyone take somebody else's card and put it into, or is that definitely, monitored, audited, or whatever?
I believe there was one instance, and it was a scandal, and it is monitored. There are, for each side, there are what we call floor staff that are on the floor. In fact, I, in my past role, played that role to a certain extent where they're watching, and you can kind of watch it. And so they watch and make sure not only it's sort of authentic, but also, too, I had the unpleasant task of having to go up to some of these members and say, you voted no? Do you really want to vote no? I think you want to vote yes on this bill. I think you want to vote yes. And in fact, one time I had to go wake up a member of Congress who was taking a nap in the cloakroom after he cast his vote and wake him up and tell him that he had, sorry, you voted wrong, wrong. And so that kind of stuff happens on a regular basis. Yes, you can change it. So in the House, they have a standard vote is 15 minutes. It usually runs a little bit longer than that. But so you can be there and you can vote, punch your card in and vote yes or no. And during that 15 minutes, you can look on the board and say, oh, no one from my state is voting yes. Go back and hit no and change it. And then after they call the vote, you can go to the floor and request in person a vote change, which is a little harder to do because people notice it. If you do it while the vote's going on, no one knows. And like I said, it happened. And sometimes, quite honestly, I remember every week I'd pull out the votes and I'd look at how my boss had voted. And I remember saying to him, I said, what were you thinking on that? He goes, oh, I thought I voted yes for that. I thought no on that. And they do make mistakes, too, just because they're not paying close attention. They're in conversation or what have you. So. The executive branch, the administration, when you talk about the White House, there's the executive office of president is all-encompassing. It's beyond just the quote-unquote Oval Office or the White House staff. If you ever watched West Wing or any of those shows, there are the Office of Management Budget and their national security team and other presidential entities that are part of that sort of executive office. It's all on the White House campus there on and around Pennsylvania Avenue. Then there's 15 departments that comprise the cabinet, and then 100 independent agencies. And the thing is about working with the administration, it doesn't always speak with one voice. You've got different sort of factions with, you know, White House may not agree with the agencies. Within agencies, there can be disagreement from, you know, FDA may think we can take our time, and the Secretary of HHS said, no, hurry up on that blood testing device. And just, you know, when we talk about an administration, and I didn't have the data from 2009, but in 2001, President Bush had 3,000 appointees to run a government of 1.7 million employees. So you think about that, and there are schisms that happen with your appointed political appointments, 3,000, and the 1.7 who are there, career employees who are there, administration, and there are differences. And navigating through that can be a challenge in terms of, do you always, you know, start at the top, the political, or you start at the bottom, you work your way up, or do you know, some combination thereof? And again, it's more art than science. Each agency has its own sort of culture and its own sort of rhythm, and knowing that is important. You know, we work, as I mentioned, regularly with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and that's a very unique agency in that there are distinct silos, and the payment side doesn't always talk to the quality side or the survey and certification side, and they're very siloed, and it's hard to force that cooperation and collaboration with them. But, you know, again, you can work through it and can try and figure out ways to advocate with them. In terms of, generally speaking, you can also use the executive branch, advocate with them to change policy. One thing you can do is each year the president's required to send to Congress a budget request, which is a detailed request for all of the funding they want for all of their programs and activities. And if you work with the president to say, I've got a great idea for a new program or change in a program, and if that gets put in the president's budget, not as though Congress takes it and says, great, here it is, and agrees to it, but it can drive the issue, can foster some action and reaction from Congress. The State of the Union address, again, is a bully pulpit, and there have been times in the past where working with the White House to try and get the president to raise an issue, to raise a profile of an issue, to force some action on it. You can use the regulatory process to affect policy. Each year, CMS issues rules to make changes in all of their different payment systems, and we've, in the past, have used that to change, you know, the reimbursement for home training for dialysis at home. We've used it to adjust the payments for the small, low-volume providers. So you can work through the regulatory process to affect policy. Again, it's a arduous process in terms of work with the agency before they put out a proposed rule, commenting, you know, preparing public comments to the proposed rule. If they didn't quite get it right, following up with them after the fact. And it's a slow and arduous process, but it is a process available to you. You can also work with the Office of Management Budget that will review all those regulations before they get finalized. So we've oftentimes, if you don't have much luck with the agency, you can sometimes go to the Office of Management and Budget and try and get them to consider your position as well. The administration, generally speaking, is more not so much individual constituents, but more the public opinion as a whole. If something they're doing is becoming unpopular or creating negative media, that's what will force change. The other area they tend to be sensitive to is members of Congress, and whether it's from their own party and trying to be helpful to them, or whether it's from the leaders in the Congress, committee chairs or other leaders, they have to listen to them as well. So you can use Congress also to influence the executive branch. As I mentioned, you can, you know, vice versa, use the executive branch to influence the Congress. Most of what I've talked about is what we would call the traditional government relations, which is what our company does. Our company is a little bit unique in that we are owned by a communications public relations firm, Burson Marsteller. They're owned by an advertising company, Young and Rubicam, and they're owned by a British communications holding company, WPP. So we're part of a broader communications network, and there's oftentimes we will partner and put together a robust, full campaign with our public relations, parent company, grassroots company, advertising, and those tend to be, those big integrated campaigns tend to be on big national issues, and we are, part of that. We are also, quite honestly, most of our clients and most of our work are just with us and don't involve these broader campaigns. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these other elements that you can use to affect policy in terms of media and grassroots and stakeholder engagement. So in terms of media, you can use the media to shape public policy. And it used to be 15, 20 years ago where network television was a predominant source of information, followed by print newspapers, followed by radio. And in fact, it wasn't that long ago, when I was still on Capitol Hill, it wasn't that long ago, where really on Capitol Hill, the print media was really drove a lot of the story of the day. And it used to be that we would hold our negotiating meetings late in the day, and we knew when the deadlines were for these print publications, and we would basically wait them out and stay in the room until we knew it was past their deadline, and then we'd go out of the room, and then they would pepper us on questions. We could float trial balloons, knowing it wouldn't run to the next day, and you had basically a 24-hour window to get that, work out the deals. Today, it's not like that. Everyone knows everything immediately. Twitter, Facebook, all these social media, everyone knows everything. But too, it also gives forums for your associations and other associations too to use the social media to help try and drive issues or drive messaging. Now, quite honestly, some issues lend themselves better to media communications campaigns than others. I mean, some issues are just frankly either too complex or too sort of in the weeds to lend itself to this. I mean, the most famous example was there's a bill that was pending through the Congress about internet privacy that some Google and some of the other companies did not like. And they waged a virtual lobbying campaign that was very effective and got Congress to stop on it. And so that issue translates better to the social media than perhaps some smaller issues. But again, you can use this, whether it's to communicate with members of Congress or your members or both, in terms of what your advocacy efforts are doing. I mentioned the grassroots campaigns. I talked about the sort of the direct lobbying in Washington or back in the state. There's also a technique they call these grassroots and grass top campaigns, where you're trying to get very local, very much on the ground in members' congressional districts or states. And there's one of our sister companies called Direct Impact that specializes this. And this is not necessarily to drive 400 or 535 members of Congress. In fact, they're working on one issue right now where they're just trying to get 3 senators to call the White House. So they're finding people on the ground in those states who know those senators, who maybe will be having coffee with them on the weekend or going on a fishing trip with them or whatever it may be, to try and get those local contacts to make the advocacy point directly to the member of Congress. Or, again, in the community, trying to get these issues raised on a very local level in like the very local newspapers and trying to get some attention that way. Generally, it's done through the public relations companies, but they do what they call stakeholder engagement and trying to get sort of other voices aligned with what you're trying to do to get those outside voices to help drive the government on the inside. And so they do, you can see an illustration from one of our shared clients did this a few years ago, but basically they do what they call stakeholder mapping. Who's saying what about our issue? Where are they? And the different places on the map and colors and size kind of indicates the level of engagement of all these different entities, whether they're think tanks. They talk about the DC quote unquote elite, the thought leaders, the DC media, other interested parties. Where are they on our issue, and how can we move them to move our issue? And again, this is done generally through a public relations campaign, and again, generally on a bigger, sort of higher profile issue. So bottom line is, how do you get things done? How do you navigate through all this? And the most important thing to do is to get a champion, a real leader who agrees with you on the issue and will actually work it and see it through. And you want to build support around that champion or champions in terms of other members of Congress, in terms of third-party validation, in terms of you can generate news media or constituent contacts. You basically want your champion to do the right thing, to do something that's of your mutual interest, mutual benefit. But all these advocacy campaigns, many of us at my firm have experienced working on political campaigns. And in a political campaign, when you start the campaign, you write a campaign plan. And as you move along and as the polling comes in and as the issues change and circumstances change, my opponent said, "What? Oh, wow, let's run with that." You have to be flexible and change on the fly. And that's what a good advocacy plan does, is as things, as you're working and maybe you assess that, the way we said that in that meeting, it didn't really go over well. Let's say it a different way. Let's try this approach. And being flexible and changing it and evolving it over time usually means you can be successful because you're learning from your mistakes and successes too. Because there have been times too when, we've said things and, maybe it was off the cuff, maybe it wasn't prepared. You say something and the staff or a member nodding in agreement. You say, we got to use that more often or put more emphasis on that aspect of the issue. So there are some big health issues in Washington. I think the Affordable Care Act and the whole repeal and replace, I think that is, finally fading or is going to fade soon. And I think that there are going to be some issues with that and with Medicare and Medicaid and other federal health programs. Our federal health programs combined represent over 20% of our total federal budget. And so using the old, the Willie Sutton line about, rob banks because that's where the money is, Congress and the administration will be looking at the health programs because that's where the money is. Now, whether it's in the context of saving money for efficiency, deficit reduction, or whether it's being used to find savings for other new initiatives in healthcare or otherwise, they will be looking at them. And you can, there are both threats, changing a program that changing a reimbursement or what have you, that can be damaging, but there's also opportunities. In the past, some big, significant health changes have come about in what we call a budget reconciliation bill. The optometrists got their physician status in a deficit reduction budget reconciliation bill in the 1980s. So even though that, yes, they may be ultimately trying to save money, there are ways to work with the Congress to get things, positive changes made in health programs. So you can look at this both ways, as both a threat and an opportunity if they're looking to make changes for fiscal reasons to these programs. Mentioned the need for savings. There is a huge need for savings because there's a constant and ongoing effort to address the Medicare sustainable growth rate. This was a policy put in place in 1997 as part of the Balanced Budget Act. And the idea was a good one, which was sort of let's put Medicare spending on the sort of gradual, nice, steady plane. And so that if it ever spikes up, we can kind of pull it back a little bit. Well, in practice, it hasn't quite worked out that way. And now it has set up a system whereby physicians and other Medicare providers face this cliff of 20-something% cut, not a cut in the increase, a cut, unless Congress acts to turn it off. So there is a bipartisan, bicameral bill to replace that system with a new payment policies that, again, the old fee-for-service Medicare payment systems are going the way of the past. They're looking at more care coordination. They're looking to replace, to put more emphasis on value or volume. They're looking at new alternative payment models and creative new payment models and ways to improve and incent better care. So this Medicare legislation has been passed out of both the House Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee. So it's sort of ripe and pending potentially for action yet this year. The problem is they have to find over $200 billion to pay for this because replacing that formula costs about that over 10 years. So there's a chance that this could see action by the end of the year, but more likely they will probably act sometime after January 1st and before the April deadline for the next cliff in it. And again, this, the challenge is if you don't do something, you could see payments cut, but there's also opportunities to try and get other Medicare policies or health policies put into that bill. The House Energy and Commerce Committee has launched this 21st Century Cures Initiative. And the whole idea behind this is what impediments are there for bringing, doing more for cures in terms of science, in terms of the research, in terms of streamlining the approval process of drugs and devices for better, what barriers are there to using medical technology. And there are, quite honestly, both regulatory and payment barriers currently in place for using telehealth and technology and medicine. And there's great promise, though, to using those. And so they're sorting through this, and right now they've been putting out a series of white papers and have had a bunch of roundtables, and they're listening and seeking ideas. And in fact, we went in to see them on a couple of occasions, and they are very, very interested in hearing from health experts. So if you have, if your association has something in this innovation space, the committee would be very receptive, whether it's an in-person meeting or, frankly, even just written communication. They will probably seek to move this as a bill. There may not be time this year, but probably early next year. This may ultimately wind up as part of the next, Washington is a town of acronyms, and I try not to use them when I'm not in Washington, but this is one of my all-time favorites. The bill for the FDA is called PDUFA, and so that's the acronym. So the next PDUFA reauthorization to reauthorize the FDA may be where all this gets sorted out and all these new ideas play out. So, and that process, again, to reauthorize the FDA, it takes some years in the making to finally get a bipartisan product that can get through both the House and Senate. So if you are going to go to Washington and roam the halls of Congress, what are some of the sort of best practices? What are the tips to do it? And these tips really, frankly, apply whether you're in the capital in Washington, D.C., or your state capital, or even, quite honestly, your city council chamber or whatever. If you set up a meeting with an elected official or a government agency, it's just common courtesy. You got to be there on time. You don't want to be late. In fact, you want to be a little bit early, because sometimes these are busy people and they might be free a few minutes early and might take you in early, and you might get more time that way. In fact, that happened to me. We were going to see the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and we were there 15 minutes early, and he saw me in the hallway. He said, I'm glad you're here. I got called into another meeting. Come in, let's go. And we went and started our meeting and got more time with them as a result. So you want to sort of hurry up, get up there, get through security, and be there early, and then you have to wait around a little bit for the meeting to start, and that's okay. As I mentioned, you have to be ready for the unexpected. The member grabbing you in, or maybe the member got called away and you get only staff, or maybe the member, like Debbie's had the pleasure of doing, has to walk to a committee meeting or vote and talk along the way. We had Stephanie, we had to do a quick pitch in the literally elevator speech in the elevator going down to a vote and try to make the sale, as you do it. So you have to be very flexible and expect the unexpected. There's a lot of young staff who work in Washington, and the fun and nice thing about working on Capitol Hill or in Washington is that people at a young age are given a lot of responsibility and a lot of opportunity. So even though they may look like they just came out of high school, they may have a lot of power, and they certainly have a lot of influence within their office because the member of Congress they work for trusts them and values their opinion. So even though they look like they're not very old, don't be fooled by that. And in fact, actually, as I get a little older, there are a lot of members of Congress who look like they just came out of high school or college that are a lot younger than me. So you need to be crisp in your presentation. If you're meeting with a member of Congress, you should not expect any more than 20 minutes. That's maximum. So if you've got 20 minutes, you really have to get your points across crisply and sharply early, and you want to also have your ask. You don't want to have a meeting with someone and not ask them for something. Consideration, voting, co-sponsorship, sponsor, whatever it is, but something. You need to go in and say, here's the issue, and here's what we want you to do about it. and get that in quickly, because you want to leave time for questions, discussion, back and forth, and dialogue. You don't want to just drone on and on and on for the 20 minutes. If you go to Capitol Hill, almost every office you walk into and say you have a meeting, the first thing they say is, do you have a business card? Almost, that's kind of standard practice now. So bring lots of business cards. And if you have a meeting with a member of Congress and you've got a one-pager summarizing your issue, engage directly with the member of Congress, look them in the eye and hand them the paper. They may hand it to their staff, but don't start with the staff. Engage directly with the member of Congress. As I mentioned, I think it's 47 days away from the elections. So this is coming to a close. And in the House, there are 46 members who are either defeated in their primary, running for their office, or not running at all, and 18 who are in races as toss-ups. So you have the potential for easily 50, 60, maybe 75 new members of the House next year, brand new. So there's going to be a lot on your issues. If you're engaged with the Congress, a lot of education about you and your issues. And the Senate, but having said that, with all that change, the composition of the House is not likely to change. Republicans are almost guaranteed, because of the redistricting, to retain control of the House. In fact, they may even pick up 5 or 10 House seats. In the Senate, you got 7 incumbent senators in races that are rated as toss-up. 6 of the 7 are Democrats. Democrats have 3 open seats that are already being rated as likely to become Republican seats. So in the Senate, it looks like a change is probably coming in terms of Republicans getting the 6 seats necessary for majority. Again, a lot can happen in 47 days. They always say a day is an eternity in politics, and you never know what can happen. But today, the winds are blowing towards probably a change in the Senate. So with the House remaining the same and the Senate possibly changing, what does that mean for the next Congress? There's going to be changes because, earlier this year there was talk of leadership shake-up in the House, and quite honestly, that has dissipated somewhat. And my view is that winning cures a lot of ills. So if the Republicans come back with a few more House members, I think the same leadership team stays going forward, but they do have to be elected in November. They also have in the House at least 7, possibly up to 9, new full committee chairmen. They have term limits on chairmen in the House. I think 8 or 9 are facing them. A couple are going to seek waivers for various reasons from the rules. But anyway, you're going to see wholesale new leadership on a lot of these big committees, Ways and Means and Budget and a few others. And in the Senate, they have a different term limit rule. And so if the Senate changes hands, you've got some Republican senators who have, quote unquote, time left as chairman. So they can reclaim a chairmanship from another senator who's currently the ranking member. So for example, on the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Sessions from Alabama is the ranking member. Senator Mike Enzi is more senior than him. He could, if they flip, he may claim the chairmanship from him and take that. So there's going to be a lot of turnover, a lot of change happening in November and December before the next Congress. They also have to figure out how many slots each party has on the committees based on the election outcome. So that's going to change. So all this is going to be changing in November and December, and then really in January they'll sort of hit the ground running and start up the new Congress. So with that, and I've put my contact information, so I'd be happy to take questions now, or if you think of something later today or tomorrow, want to email or call me, I'm happy to do it. Please.
This is a very simple question. Shows my ignorance. What does bicameral mean? You keep saying bipartisan and bicameral.
I looked it up too, don't feel bad.
I'm sorry. Again, when you talk about the divide between the House and Senate, it's House and Senate. So when I say the both chambers are in agreement, that's what the term bicameral means.
Rich, you did a great job. I mean, you gave an expert's view of what the Washington landscape looked like, and also you were so explicit about how the Congress workings were. I know you gave us a basic, but still just to look at some of the information, even the courtesies that go to, if you were given the presentation to meet with a congressman at any level. I like the way you said that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Can I ask
you a question?
Yes.
So something like there's the national shortage of PD fluids, and it's actually healthcare rationing that we've not seen before. So we write a letter to the FDA, and the FDA responded yesterday, well, we're moving, it just takes time. So if we really wanted to get a fire going under their butts, how do we do it? What would be a next step?
That's a great question, and that's where it's a little bit of, and that's where it's more of the art than the science. So you have to be careful, and we did write a letter to the FDA, but it was not a real aggressive letter, because sometimes you can have, if you're too aggressive or too demanding, it can blow up in your face, and you can spin the direction the other way. They can say, we're tired of hearing from you. Quit, leave us alone. In fact, because you're bugging me so much and you're distracting me, I'm going to take even longer to do it. So there's a little bit of a art and art to it. And so I think that on that specific example, I think NRAA did their own letter. The Home Alliance is doing their others. I think that kind of drumbeat will be helpful to try and get them to move. The next step might be, again, to try and get some friendly voices from Capitol Hill to call and inquire. If they continue to drag their feet, to call and inquire and say, what are you doing about this? And again, you have to be very careful to do this. Because like I said, I've seen this go both ways, where you can do a real aggressive campaign, you can get things to move real quick, but you can do a real aggressive campaign and have it blow up in your face. So.
Kidney caucus people that have an interest in kidney care and ask out of concern.
And again, when I talked about the committee's jurisdiction, the agencies respond to the committee that funds them, who they get their money from, because they want to be able to get the money they want. They also respond to the oversight committee because they don't want to have to appear before them and be defensive at a hearing. So if the committee that has oversight over them says, what are you doing about it? Maybe we should have a hearing about this shortage. Maybe we should draw attention to it. No. We don't need to go that far. We'll fix it. We'll fix it. So the threat of the public display sometimes can be effective too.
Rich, can you talk just for a minute about what happens when their agency turns over in a new election cycle on the executive side, and how that relates to their relationship with Congress, and at what level sometimes that turnover happens?
Yes. So the next presidential election, whoever wins has from the Wednesday after the election until January 20th, that period is what they call the transition. And they do what they call parachute teams, where it's usually volunteers, and sometimes it's people like me who will drop into an agency, figure out where all the, who's doing what, how it's working, report back to the campaign, because it's still a campaign at that point, saying, when we come in, I think we need to make these changes or organize it this way. So that transition period takes place on a kind of volunteer basis. And then once they come in, and then they start to, over time, make their appointments, then the appointments will come in and try to shape it as the campaign and transition team envisioned it. It's really a fascinating process for how, there's frustration about how slow government can work generally, but those transition teams, they go in and it's round the clock work, and that does move very, very quickly. So that's kind of interesting to watch. And you can too. I remember, I guess in 2008, you can too engage and interact with that. We set up a meeting for one client with a transition team leader, and they came and listened to our views and didn't agree with them, but they listened, and at least we had our input. So that's the other thing too. Just one other parting comment is, sometimes people get frustrated when they don't get the right answer, and I always tell people that no is actually the second best answer in Washington, because at least you know where they are. They're not going to do it, or they're not going to agree with you. Okay, so they're not with me. At least I know. That's actually better than not knowing, and I don't know if they're yes or no. So a no is actually not bad, because if they're not with you on that issue, maybe they can help you on something else, or maybe they can over time bring around. I know in this Congress you can't be with me, but maybe after you get reelected, you can reconsider. So, any other questions? thank you.